The woman standing in Petra's doorway carried a stillness that didn't feel natural so much as earned. It was the kind of stillness that belongs to people who have spent years learning, often painfully, exactly how much space they are allowed to occupy in any given room, and how carefully they must move within it if they want to be tolerated instead of noticed. She wore a charcoal linen blazer over a plain white shirt, the kind of outfit that doesn't try to say anything about the person wearing it, yet somehow ends up saying more than anything decorative ever could. Her dark hair was pinned low at the nape of her neck with a kind of precision that suggested habit rather than style. Nothing about her was accidental. Her eyes were on me, but not in a direct way at first. It was the look of someone trying to match a face to a memory that refuses to settle into place. Like recognizing a word you have heard before, but cannot quite retrieve the meaning of. I had the unsettling feeling that she was close to remembering me without ever having properly known me. What she did not know yet was that I had already known her. Not in the way people usually mean when they say that, but in fragments, in sound, in presence without visibility. I knew her voice before I knew her face. I had heard it the night before, coming through the thin hotel wall that separated two strangers trying to sleep in the same building while carrying entirely different kinds of insomnia. It had not been loud. In fact, it had been almost careful in its quietness. But there are voices that do not need volume to fill a space. They carry weight instead. She was Petra's mother. She was also the woman from the room beside mine, the one who had spoken softly into a phone at around 2 a.m, unaware that the silence on my side of the wall had already stopped being silence the moment her words began to exist inside it. I had not meant to listen. At first, I had even tried not to. But there are moments when stopping feels more impossible than continuing. And her voice had that quality that made absence of attention feel like refusal of something important. She had been crying quietly, not dramatically, not in a way that asked for interruption. It was controlled, restrained, as if even her grief had learned manners. Then she had spoken. She had said she was done, pretending that a life built around other people's comfort was the same thing as being alive. She had said it with a clarity that did not sound rehearsed. More like something she had been holding for a very long time, and had only just found the conditions necessary to release it without breaking. Her name, I learned later, was Solon Marquetti. Petra introduced her with the easy brightness of someone trying to merge two worlds that had never properly touched before. "Mom, this is Beeks," Petra said, arms open, voice warm in a performative kind of way that only children can manage with parents they both love and fear disappointing. "She's brilliant and annoying, and she saved my entire thesis presentation last semester by staying up until 4 a.m. fixing my citations." Solon did not immediately extend her hand. She looked at me first, not casually, not briefly. She looked at me with the kind of attention that makes a person feel evaluated rather than simply seen. There was no hostility in it, but there was something far more unsettling than hostility. There was assessment, quiet, patient, deliberate. In that pause, something passed between us that neither of us acknowledged, recognition or the beginning of it. When she finally shook my hand, it was firm and brief, professional in a way that felt almost protective. Like she had decided, at least for the moment, that distance was safer than curiosity. "Nice to meet you," she said, and I knew her voice immediately, the same voice that had come through the wall in the hotel room, low, controlled, carefully contained, but not empty. There was something underneath the control that suggested it was constantly being maintained, like pressure held behind glass. Petra's apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that leaned slightly toward age rather than collapse, the kind of place that had once been affordable in a city that was slowly forgetting what affordable meant. The walls were covered in prints from different cities, collected without a strict plan, more like emotional souvenirs than decoration. Plants occupied every available corner, some thriving, some surviving out of obligation alone. The kitchen looked like someone cooked with enthusiasm and cleaned only when enthusiasm returned on its own terms. I had spent more nights in that apartment than in my own over the past year. Petra Marquetti was my closest friend. The kind of friend who knew which fears were reasonable and which ones I had invented to avoid confronting the real ones that didn't yet have names. She knew things about me I had only ever admitted in the soft collapse of late-night conversations, usually over cheap wine and exhaustion pretending to be honesty. What she did not know was that I had spent the night before in a hotel because my heating had failed again. and the building management had perfected the art of delaying responsibility until it resembled policy. And in the room beside mine, Solon Marquetti had been speaking into the dark like she believed no one was listening. But someone had been listening. I had not intended to. The walls were thin in a way that removed all possibility of innocence from sound, and her voice had not been loud enough to demand attention. It had simply existed with enough gravity to pull attention toward it. She had spoken about years spent becoming what other people needed her to be. She had spoken about choices made with logic and responsibility that still somehow left her wondering whether correctness and living were ever the same thing. She had spoken about love once, long ago, with a woman whose laughter she described as something like a door opening in winter. There was no dramatization in the way she said it. That was what made it stay. When Petra invited us to sit, the apartment shifted into something closer to domestic rhythm. Wine was poured without ceremony. Food appeared in uneven stages of completion. Petra moved through the space like she had designed it specifically for interruptions. Solon watched her daughter with a fondness that softened every line of her face without making her any less sharp. It was not indulgent affection. It was recognition. The kind that understands imperfection fully and chooses it anyway without negotiation. At some point, Petra left the room, pulled into an emergency that sounded both dramatic and entirely typical of her life. And then it was just the two of us. The room changed immediately, not visibly, but perceptibly, like air pressure adjusting when a door closes. Solon refilled my glass without asking. She did everything with that same efficiency, as though usefulness did not require acknowledgement. The silence between us was not empty. It was occupied. Eventually, I spoke without fully planning to. There are moments when words arrive before permission. "You seem tired in a way that isn't about today," I said. She set the bottle down. The movement was small, but it changed the room. Her eyes returned to mine with the same careful evaluation from the doorway, except now there was something else layered underneath it. Something that had recognized itself in my sentence. "That is a very specific thing to say to someone you have just met," she replied. I know, the silence returned but differently, not defensive, not closed, measured. Then she spoke again. "I have been told I project composure effectively." "Yes," I said, "you do." A pause. "But you are working very hard at it right now," I added, without fully deciding to. Something in her expression shifted. Not breaking, revealing, like pressure redistributing rather than releasing. She looked at her glass, then at me, as if deciding whether I had crossed a line or simply named something already visible. Finally, she spoke. "I have been in family court for 6 months," she said. "A case involving a child who will likely be placed with the wrong parent, and there is nothing I can do within the system that changes that outcome." Her voice remained steady, not because it was easy, because it was practiced. "I have been doing this work for more than 2 decades, she continued, "and I have learned that correctness in systems does not always align with justice in outcomes. I have also learned that carrying what I cannot fix does not make me effective. It only makes me tired in ways that accumulate." She stopped there. Not because she was finished, because she had already said the part that mattered most. I did not offer comfort. It would have been too simple, too small for what had just been shared. Instead, I answered honestly, "The ones who stop carrying it are usually the ones who stop doing the work entirely," I said. Her gaze stayed on me for a long moment, not evaluating anymore, understanding, and in that quiet, something between us settled into place that neither of us had yet given a name, but both of us had already begun to recognize as real. The moment stayed in me longer than it should have, the way certain truths do, when they land in places you did not realize were exposed. It was the first time I understood something without it being said directly. That she had heard something in my voice that echoed what she had once heard in her own silence. When she decided, however briefly, to loosen her grip on the version of herself she had spent years maintaining, not fully, not completely, but enough, Petra returned after 22 minutes, walking in with the energy of someone who has just resolved a crisis that only existed because of other people's inability to function properly. She dropped into her chair with a satisfied exhale, announcing, in her own way, that disaster had been managed, timelines salvaged, and chaos postponed once again through sheer force of personality and persistence. She began eating as if nothing in the room had changed, which either meant she truly hadn't noticed the shift in atmosphere or she had decided, consciously or instinctively, that acknowledging it would not improve anything. Petra had always been good at letting things exist without requiring explanation. Solon, however, changed instantly, not in a dramatic way, not in a way anyone else would have immediately named. It was more subtle than that. Within the space of a breath, she rebuilt herself into the version of her I had first met at the door. Composed, measured, controlled. The woman who could stand in a room and never appear to take up more space than necessary. The transformation was so seamless, it might have gone unnoticed if I had not already seen the absence of it. If I had not already heard what she sounded like when the structure she built around herself loosened, even slightly, and yet, even as she returned to that composed state, her eyes flicked toward me once, a brief, precise glance. Not searching anymore, but checking. The way someone confirms whether they were observed while becoming someone else again. I was watching. She knew I was. Neither of us acknowledged it. The rest of the evening moved forward as if nothing had shifted, yet everything had. When Solon eventually left, it was after 2 hours that felt longer and shorter at the same time. Time in that apartment did not behave normally anymore. It stretched and compressed depending on what was being said and what was being withheld. She put on her coat in the hallway with the same quiet efficiency she used for everything else in her life. There was no hesitation in her movements, only completion. She buttoned the coat, adjusted her bag over her shoulder, and turned slightly toward me before leaving. Her goodbye was no different in structure than her greeting had been, yet it carried something warmer inside it. Like a tone adjusted by a single degree that only becomes noticeable after it has passed. The handshake she offered this time was different as well. Not transformed, not changed in an obvious way, but softened at the edges, a fraction less guarded, a fraction more human. I noticed it immediately, and just as immediately, told myself not to turn it into meaning. Petra hugged her at the door for longer than usual. Solon did not resist it. She stood still, then eventually placed both arms around her daughter and closed her eyes, holding the moment in a way that suggested she did not allow herself many of them. I turned slightly away, not out of discomfort, but because some things belong only to those who are part of them. At the threshold, coat secured, bag settled on her shoulder, Solon looked at me one final time. "It was good to meet you, Beeks," she said. The way she said my name was different from how Petra said it. More deliberate, more intentional, as if she had chosen to carry it correctly, rather than casually. "Good to meet you too," I said, then she left. The door closed behind her with a soft finality that did not feel like an ending, only a pause. Petra stood there for a moment longer than necessary, then turned to me with the expression of someone actively restraining information. "What?" I asked. "Nothing," she said immediately, in the exact tone people use when they are refusing to say something that is already fully formed in their mind. That silence lasted exactly long enough to be dishonest. Then she broke it. "She asked about you on the way down." I stared at her. Petra leaned against the wall, clearly enjoying herself in the way only people who are not emotionally involved in the consequences can. "I texted her 20 minutes after she left," she added. "I told her you were brilliant, slightly terrifying and single." I closed my eyes briefly. "I am going to pretend you did not say that." Petra smiled. She said something back, she continued, now fully committed to the situation she had created. "She said you seem like someone worth knowing." The words sat in my chest longer than they should have. Worth knowing. Not impressive, not useful. Worth knowing. I sat with my phone on the train home as the city slid past the window in blurred streaks of light. The carriage rocked gently, the steady rhythm of movement making everything feel slightly unreal, as if the world outside was happening, without requiring participation from the inside. I thought about her voice through a wall in a hotel room at 2 a.m. I thought about the way truth sounds when it is spoken without an audience in mind. I thought about how rare it is for someone to say something real, when they believe no one will ever repeat it back to them. I thought about Solon sitting across from me in daylight, composed and careful, and still allowing something unguarded to surface when she spoke long enough without interruption. Then I looked at the message Petra had sent me. "She seems like someone worth knowing." I did not reply immediately. 6 minutes passed before I finally wrote back. That might be the most formal compliment I have ever received secondhand. Petra responded almost instantly with 3 laughing emojis, followed by another message that changed the direction of everything without pretending it was doing so. She asked for your number. I did not answer right away. I watched the message sit there through the entire rest of the train ride, the words repeating themselves in different tones inside my head, none of them fully stable. By the time I reached home, the heating in my flat had finally been repaired. The radiator made its slow, metallic sounds of reluctant cooperation, as if the system itself had only just agreed to return to function after a long internal argument. I sat on the edge of my bed with my coat still on, phone in my hand, staring at nothing in particular. I waited. Not for a message exactly, for a decision. It came that evening at 9, no greeting, no framing, just a sentence that felt like it had been carried carefully to the surface. I said something true to someone I had decided was worth it. I don't do that often. I want you to know I noticed you noticed. I read it once, then again, then a third time, not because I needed to understand it, but because it felt like the kind of message that changes shape slightly each time you look at it. I replied slowly. I think people usually know when they are being honest if the person listening actually hears them. I heard you. She responded after a pause that felt measured even through text. That is a longer answer than I expected. I have a few of those, I wrote. I believe you, she said then. After another pause that felt heavier than the others, she added, tell me something true in return. I set my phone down, picked it up again, put it down again. Finally, I wrote what I had been carrying since the hotel. I spent a night in a room where the wall was thin enough that I could hear someone speaking into the dark about a life they had built carefully and still did not fully recognize as their own. I listened without meaning to, and I met you the next day, and your voice was the same voice. And I have been trying to understand what it means to already recognize someone before they have chosen to be known. She did not respond immediately. Then, which hotel? I told her. A longer pause followed. The walls are very thin, she wrote. I know, I replied. Then, after another silence, did you hear all of it? Enough to understand the shape of what you were carrying, I said. Enough to know you deserve to put it down. It took several minutes for her to respond. When she did, it was simple. I am going to need time to think about this. Take it, I said. Then she added something unexpected. That is not what I expected you to say. What did you expect? I asked. Something more strategic, she replied. I am not trying to win anything, I wrote. There was another pause then. No, I don't think you are. She did not text again that night. I sat in the quiet afterward, listening to the radiator and the city outside my window, caught between seasons that could not decide what they were becoming. And I thought about her again. About a woman who had done everything correctly according to every system she had ever been placed inside, and still found herself unsure whether correctness had ever been the same thing as living. I did not try to predict what would happen next. By the morning, there was another message. She had slept. She had woken. She had decided something in the space between those two states. I have a conference in the city this weekend. Saturday evening is not committed. Petra says you know a good restaurant. I read it twice, then I replied, I know several. Do you prefer somewhere where silence can exist without effort? Or somewhere where silence is noticed when it arrives? Her answer came quickly. The second, Saturday, I wrote. Saturday, she replied. And for the first time, neither of us added anything else. The laugh came suddenly, unguarded, breaking through her usual control like something slipping past a carefully held boundary. It was brief, but real in a way that changed the air between us. She didn't look away afterward. Neither did I. I said I had been thinking about her since the night at the wall. I know, she replied immediately, without hesitation, as if she had already accounted for that possibility long before I spoke it aloud. Something in me tightened for a moment. The admission felt too exposed once it was outside my control, too easily misunderstood as intrusion instead of honesty. I let that show slightly in my expression. It felt intrusive when I realized it, I said. Her reaction was calm, measured, almost analytical. Did you listen on purpose? She asked. No, I said. I believe you, she replied without delay. Then, after a brief pause, she added something that softened the edges of the entire situation. I also believe that things that arrive without being sought can still be meaningful. That shifted something between us. It reframed everything without removing the weight of it. I responded with a quiet honesty of my own. That is a very generous way of interpreting an eavesdropping situation. The corner of her mouth moved slightly. It was subtle enough that it could have been missed if I had not been watching her so closely. but I had been paying attention to every small variation in her expression since the moment we met. It wasn't a smile yet. Not fully. But it was the beginning of one, the structural possibility of it forming, something newly permitted rather than withheld. "I am trying to be generous," she said. "I am not always described that way." "You are doing well," I said. "Thank you," she replied. "I mean it," I added. "I know," she said. She looked at me in that same assessing way she had used in the doorway days earlier. But something had changed now. There was no longer anything left to measure in the same way. The initial reading had already been taken. What remained was not evaluation but presence, unfiltered by the need to categorize. Outside, the city moved through its winter rhythm. Lights softened by distance, people passing between warmth and cold, everything slightly muted, as if the world itself was conserving energy. She had a train to catch at 10. That gave us a limited stretch of time that neither of us tried to rush. I did not speak about everything I had been holding in my mind since the first moment I heard her voice through the wall. I did not mention the exact texture of that night, or how it had stayed with me longer than I had expected. I did not bring up the morning message she had sent, or the careful shape of her words when she allowed honesty to enter them without preparation. There was space for those things, but not yet. Instead, I kept it simple. "Next time, dinner in your city," I said. She looked at me directly, her expression steady, unflinching. "Next time," she said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't conditional. It was stated as fact, already placed into the structure of what was going to happen, as though she had decided and simply allowed the future to catch up to her decision. When we left the restaurant, the air outside had sharpened. The cold of February settled into everything, the kind of cold that makes movement feel more deliberate than usual. She pulled her coat on with the same precision she brought to everything else in her life, adjusting it once and then letting it sit exactly as intended. We walked toward the station together, not touching, not avoiding, just existing within a shared distance that neither of us altered. The space between us was not accidental. It was chosen. At the entrance to the station, she stopped. She turned to face me fully. The city moved behind her in soft motion, but she remained still, anchored in a way that made everything else feel briefly less certain. "I do not do things halfway," she said. "I want you to understand that before you decide what this is." Her voice was calm, direct, without hesitation. "I already understand what this is," I replied. A pause followed, the kind of pause that carries meaning without needing to explain it. "And I do not do things halfway either," I added. She studied me for a long moment, not searching anymore, but confirming something she had likely already begun to suspect. "Good," she said. The word carried more weight than it should have for something so small. It was the same word she had used before, but now it landed differently. Less observational, more final. Then she turned and walked through the station doors. I stayed where I was. The cold air pressed in around me, but I did not move immediately. I watched until she disappeared into the flow of people and structure and motion, until there was nothing left of her presence in sight. Even after that, I remained there for a while longer, standing still as the world continued without pause. I thought about voices through walls, about choices made long before I entered the picture, about the difference between correctness and truth, and how rarely those two things align in the same shape. Later, she texted from the train. I was still outside the station when my phone lit up. The message was simple, almost casual in tone. "The dining car on this train is aggressively bright and serves wine that should legally be classified as water. Thought you should know." I smiled before I even replied. "That sounds like very honest wine," I wrote. "It is trying very hard," she responded, "and failing with integrity." I stood there for a moment after that, phone in my pocket, smiling quietly at nothing in particular. The kind of smile that does not ask to be witnessed to exist. The week that followed carried its own rhythm. Work continued. Translation filled my hours, precise and demanding in ways that required attention to meaning that could not always be carried directly across language. I found myself thinking about her more often than was necessary for the task at hand, about how she had once described the weight of decisions in systems that could not hold the consequences of what they produced, about how meaning often survived only through imperfect transfer. She sent messages throughout the week. One was about a conference session that had been unexpectedly useful, and several that had not been. Another was a photograph of a window in her office, snow resting on the ledge outside, light falling in at an angle that felt familiar in a way I could not immediately explain, until I realized it resembled the light from Petra's apartment on the day I met her mother. I stared at that image longer than I intended to. The third message asked a question about restaurants. Not where to go, but how silence should exist within them. Whether it should be something that fills naturally, or something that becomes noticeable when it arrives. I answered carefully. She responded with an address, then added something unexpected. My sister would like to meet you. The sentence shifted the entire structure of the conversation, not because it was dramatic, but because it was deliberate. Her sister, she explained later, was someone who had been waiting for a long time, for Solon to speak a truth aloud, to someone who could respond to it in the real world, instead of only in private reflection. A retired professor of comparative literature, someone who described people as cases, candidates, and constructs without apology. The meeting was set for the end of March. In the weeks between February and March, Petra spoke about her mother only sparingly, always indirectly, always circling the subject rather than stepping fully into it. Once, in her kitchen while cooking, she mentioned that her mother had asked about my reliability. Petra had answered with blunt honesty, describing me as excessively dependable, to the point of being slightly concerning. Another time, while walking beside the canal, she noted that her mother had seemed different since February. Lighter, not in a way that erased who she was, but in a way that suggested something internal had shifted. She did not press further, she did not need to, and I did not try to define what I was becoming part of, because by then, it was already becoming something real. She let out a genuine laugh then, sudden and unguarded, the kind that breaks through control rather than being offered willingly. It changed her face in a way that felt almost private, as if I had been allowed to see something not usually permitted to survive in daylight. She did not look away from me after it happened, and I did not look away from her. The air between us tightened and softened at the same time, carrying a kind of clarity that did not need explanation. I said that I had been thinking about her since the night by the wall. Her response came instantly, without hesitation. I know, she said. There was no surprise in her voice, no accusation either, only acknowledgement, as though she had already accounted for that possibility long before I ever voiced it. I admitted that the realization of it had felt intrusive, something that unsettled me once I became fully aware of its shape. She listened without interruption, and asked in a steady, composed tone whether I had listened on purpose. I told her I had not. There was a pause, brief but deliberate. I believe you, she said. Then, after a fraction of silence that felt more like thought than hesitation, she added that things arriving without being sought could still carry meaning, still hold weight, still matter. That shifted something fundamental in the space between us. It reframed the entire situation without erasing its complexity. I responded with a quieter honesty, acknowledging that her framing was generous toward something that could just as easily be reduced to accidental intrusion. The corner of her mouth moved slightly in response. It was not yet a smile, not fully formed, but it was no longer absence either. It was the beginning of permission. A subtle structural change in her expression that suggested something softer might exist beneath what she usually allowed to be seen. She admitted she was trying to be generous, even though generosity was not always something she was known for. I told her she was doing well. She thanked me simply, and I told her I meant it. She answered that she knew. Then she looked at me again in that same steady, assessing way she had used when we first met, but something had changed in its function. It was no longer measuring me for understanding. The measurement had already been completed. What remained now was presence without defense. Outside, the city moved through its winter evening rhythm. Lights softened by distance, people passing between warmth and cold, wrapped in their own private urgency. She had a train to catch soon, which gave the moment a contained shape. A temporary boundary neither of us tried to rush past. I did not say everything I had been carrying since the night I first heard her voice through the thin hotel wall. I did not speak about how that sound had stayed with me, how it had followed me into silence afterward. I did not mention the message she had sent at 6:47 in the morning, or how carefully it had been written despite its apparent simplicity. There was time for those things, but not yet. Instead, I spoke only of what came next, the idea of another meeting. The possibility of dinner in her city. She looked at me directly when I said it. Her answer was immediate and steady. "Next time," she said, it was not spoken as hope or suggestion. It was stated as something already decided, already placed into motion. A fact rather than an intention. When we left the restaurant, the cold outside was sharper than before. The kind of February air that settles into bones rather than skin. She adjusted her coat with precise movements, smoothing it into place, as though even warmth had to be organized properly. We walked together toward the station, not touching, not avoiding, simply existing in parallel, close enough that distance became intentional rather than accidental. At the entrance, she stopped. The city moved behind her in layered motion, but she remained still, anchored in a way that made everything else feel briefly unstable. Her voice came calmly, without ornament. She said she did not do anything halfway, and that I should understand that before deciding what any of this meant. I told her I already understood. I added that I did not do things halfway either. There was a long pause after that, not uncomfortable, but dense with recognition. Then she said, "Good." The word carried weight far beyond its simplicity. It landed like confirmation rather than approval. She turned and walked into the station. I stayed outside in the cold until her shape disappeared completely into the movement of people and architecture and departure. Even after that, I remained there for a while longer, as if leaving would make something less real than it already was. On the train, she sent a message. The phone lit up in my hand while I was still outside the station, fingers cold, attention fixed more on anticipation than on the screen itself. The message described the dining car as aggressively bright and serving wine that should have been water. It was written with a dry clarity that made it feel almost observational rather than conversational. I replied that it sounded like very honest wine. She responded that it was trying very hard and failing with integrity. That made me smile in a way I did not try to hide from anyone, because there was no one to see it. A private expression, complete in itself. The week that followed unfolded with its own rhythm. Work continued, translation occupying my attention in precise, demanding ways. Language required decisions that were never neutral, each word carrying loss alongside meaning. I found myself thinking more than once about her sister's eventual phrasing of the untranslatable remainder, and how closely it mirrored what I already understood about her world. She continued to message some updates from the conference, some observations about people and systems, a photograph of a window in her office where snow collected on the ledge and light entered at a particular angle that felt strangely familiar, echoing the light from Petra's apartment the day I first met her. I stared at that image longer than necessary. There were other messages too, practical, simple, but always carrying an undertone of presence rather than obligation. Then came the mention of her sister, a meeting arranged in Lyon, not as an invitation framed in uncertainty, but as something already decided within her family structure. The idea of being assessed by someone who described people as constructs did not feel abstract. It felt immediate. In the weeks leading up to March, I spoke to Petra only twice about her mother. The first time was in her kitchen, where ordinary domestic movement carried on around a conversation that did not fully belong to the space. Petra mentioned that her mother had asked whether I was reliable in the way I showed up to things. Petra answered without hesitation, describing me as excessively consistent, even stubbornly so. She called it both a strength and a flaw. The second time was during a walk along the canal. The light was changing, not yet spring, but no longer fully winter. Petra spoke without framing or introduction. She said her mother seemed lighter than she had been in years. Not transformed, not altered beyond recognition, but less burdened by something she had been carrying for a long time without naming. Petra did not push further. She did not need to. And I did not define what I was becoming part of, because it was already forming without requiring permission. By the time Leon arrived, nothing about it felt like beginning anymore. It felt like continuation. The city appeared in stages, as all arrivals do when they carry expectation. First the idea, then the train, then the movement through unfamiliar countryside that slowly reshaped itself into architecture and density and presence. The station was not where she waited. She had already told me she would not be there. Her sister, Dora, would be. The apartment was older than expectation allowed for. Stone worn by time, windows framed by generations of occupation. Nothing about it felt temporary. When I rang the bell, a voice answered through the intercom with clarity and confidence. A voice similar to Solon's, but freer. Less contained, I was told to come up. The tone implied I had already been expected. Dora Marquetti opened the door and looked at me without hesitation. Her assessment was immediate. "Yes," she said simply. "All right, I see it." There was no elaboration, only recognition. Inside, the apartment held warmth that did not come from temperature alone. Books, papers, signs of thought that had accumulated over time without being removed. A table set for more people than were currently present, as though the space remembered larger gatherings. Solon appeared in the doorway, not composed in the same way as before. Here she looked slightly unassembled, as though she had not yet rebuilt the version of herself required for observation. Her hair was down, her clothes softer. Nothing performed. She saw me and said I had found the place correctly. Her sister corrected from the kitchen that Solon had been anxious since morning, and that this was not her professional voice, but her restrained one. Lunch unfolded over hours rather than minutes. Food that carried intention rather than display. Wine that did not need explanation. Conversation that moved between theory and family, and the subtle mechanics of meaning. Dora spoke about translation as something that always left a remainder behind. Something that could not be carried across without loss. She did not present this as failure. She presented it as truth. Solon watched her sister with quiet familiarity, the kind that only exists between people who have spent a lifetime understanding each other without requiring translation. Later, when we were alone in the living room, the conversation shifted, not abruptly, but inevitably. The space between us had already been shaped by everything that came before it. She asked for honesty without softening, without adjustment. I gave it, not polished, not structured for comfort, just truth. What I wanted was not performance or strategy or carefully managed distance. It was something fully present, something that did not divide itself into versions depending on context. She listened without interruption. When I finished, she admitted she had not experienced something like that before. Not in the way it required mutual presence without protection. She spoke about having lived fully, about knowing women at different times, about not being inexperienced in the way assumptions might suggest. I told her I already knew, not from information but from pattern, from language, from the way she structured meaning. She accepted that without resistance. Then she said she had thought about me every day since we met, not as repetition, as persistence. I told her I had done the same. The conversation slowed after that, not from uncertainty, but from arrival at something neither of us needed to define further in words. Then she said my name, not measured, not controlled, simply spoken, and I crossed the remaining distance between us. There was no hesitation in it, only recognition finally allowed to become action. When she kissed me, it was not tentative or uncertain. It was deliberate, grounded in the full understanding of what had been building, long before either of us acknowledged it aloud. When she pulled back slightly, her hand remained on my face, steady and warm, as though confirming I was still there. And she said she should have done that in February. I told her she had not been ready then. She accepted that without resistance. After a moment, she asked whether I was always this patient. I told her I only waited when I believed the waiting was not wasted. Her hand moved slightly along my jaw, and the space between us remained unchanged, because neither of us felt any need to increase or reduce it. It simply existed now with clarity rather than uncertainty. She said it was a very kind thing to say. I told her I wasn't being kind. I was being accurate. I heard it in her exhale immediately, the small release of someone who had spent too long around people who confused softness with care, and kindness with something that required self-erasure. There was a history in that sound. Not loud, not dramatic, but deeply familiar to someone who had learned to listen closely. Dora emerged from her study exactly 2 hours later, as if she had been measuring the passage of time with deliberate precision. That timing alone told me she had been aware of everything happening in the room, even without being physically present for it. She looked at us on the sofa with calm attention, taking in the scene without comment at first, and then simply said she understood. It was not curiosity. It was confirmation. Dora declared she would make coffee and pretend she had seen nothing, which she described as her version of discretion. Then she disappeared into the kitchen, leaving behind the sound of the coffee machine starting, steady and grounding. Solon watched her sister go with a quiet expression I had begun to recognize as fond exasperation, the kind that carries affection underneath its restraint. She is going to tell this story for years, she said softly. It is a good story, I replied. Yes, she said after a moment. Measured. Precise. The The kind that stays. There was no disagreement between us. The train back later that evening felt different from the one that had brought me there. Something had shifted into place that no longer required interpretation. Dora had insisted on one final meal before I left, smaller than lunch but sharper in flavor, as if condensed deliberately into memory rather than consumption. At the door, she held my hands and looked at me directly. "You are what I thought you would be," she said. I asked what she had thought I would be. She said I was someone who hears what sits underneath what is spoken. Not the surface of words, but what they are trying to reach. She said it as fact, not as praise. Then she released my hands. "Take care of that," she added. "I will," I answered. "I know," she said immediately, as though certainty itself was part of her nature. Solon walked me to the metro afterward. The evening in Lyon carried the quiet weight of old stone and river air, the kind of city that feels as though it has been absorbing human decisions for centuries. We walked close enough that presence was shared but never assumed. Neither of us adjusted the distance. It remained deliberate. At the metro entrance, she stopped under the streetlight. The light was harsher there, more honest, removing any softness the evening had offered. She looked at me and spoke with clarity. She said she needed to tell me something before I left. It wasn't hesitation. It was structure. She acknowledged the gap in age between us. Not as uncertainty but as context. Something she wanted spoken aloud so it could not become distortion later. I listened without interruption. When she finished, I responded with equal directness. I told her my age. I told her about my past relationships, the ones that mattered and the ones that only pretended to. I told her about the last 2 years of deliberate solitude, not out of fear of connection, but because nothing had felt precise enough to justify it. I told her I had heard her voice through a wall before I ever saw her face, and that I had understood immediately that she was someone who had already done the work of being known, even if she had not yet found the conditions where it felt safe. There was silence after that, not empty silence, but one filled with recognition. Then she stepped forward and kissed me under the streetlight, outside the metro entrance in Lyon. It was not tentative. It was not uncertain. It was decided. A passerby moved around us and made a small sound of acknowledgement, the kind people make when they witness something real without needing to interfere with it. When she pulled back, she did not fully compose herself. There was still something visible in her expression that had not yet been reorganized into control. I was glad for it. I told her I would call when I arrived home. She said she would be awake. I said I knew. The train ride back carried a different kind of silence, not absence, but integration. I looked out at the passing countryside and thought about translation, about what is carried across and what is inevitably left behind. I came to understand something simple and final. In this case, there were no acceptable losses. Not for her, not for what was forming between us. What mattered was not preservation of what had been, but the construction of something that did not require translation in the same way. Something that could exist without remainder. She called instead of texting later that night. I answered immediately. She said she preferred hearing my voice rather than reading it. We spoke for an hour, and when I returned home, the call continued while I moved through my flat, making tea with one hand, listening with the other. She told me about her sister afterward, about Dora sitting in her apartment with wine, watching the ceiling and saying, "Finally," as if something had resolved after a long delay. She spoke about how Dora had always believed Solon was suppressing something. But the truth, she explained, was not suppression. It was patience, a long waiting for conditions that never arrived, and then, in this version of life, they had. "I reached for it," she said simply. That sentence carried no uncertainty, only arrival. April came with a clarity that felt almost structured in its own right. Work continued. Life stabilized in ways that no longer felt provisional. She came to my city twice. Once for work, fully separated from anything personal. Once for no reason other than presence. The second visit changed everything that had previously felt like becoming. There was no performance in it anymore. Only continuity. We walked through the city in the morning. She bought bread and evaluated it with quiet seriousness, as though quality was something worth noticing properly. She read my books with genuine attention, not as decoration but as entry points into thought. She sat beside me while I worked, and eventually worked alongside me in silence that felt shared rather than filled. When she met Priya, there was no performance from either side. Priya studied her briefly, then accepted her presence without hesitation. I've heard about you, Priya said. I hope it was accurate, Solon replied. More than accurate, Priya said. That was all that needed to be said. Later, on my balcony in the evening light of April, Solon stood watching the street below. She was quiet in the way she became when she was not managing anything, simply existing without calculation. I watched her watching the city. She noticed. I told her I was looking because she seemed different there. She asked how. I said she looked like someone who was no longer deciding how much space to take up, but already understanding that she belonged in it. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she turned fully toward me, and for a moment there was no structure in her expression at all. Only presence, not guarded, not measured, just real, and in that stillness, it became clear that nothing between us had been an accident, and nothing from that point forward would require pretending otherwise. Petra said it was a very kind thing to say, but I told her I was not being kind. I was being accurate. There is a difference she understood immediately, even if she did not name it out loud. I heard it in her exhale anyway, the small release of someone who has spent too long around people who confuse softness with care and politeness with truth. Dora came out of her study exactly 2 hours later, as if she had been timing her re-entry into the world with deliberate precision. She looked at us on the sofa without surprise, only confirmation, as though everything she had expected had already unfolded correctly. I see, she said, with quiet satisfaction that carried more meaning than the words themselves. Celine did not move away from me. Dora simply announced she was going to make coffee, and that discretion, in her version, meant pretending nothing needed to be acknowledged. The machine started humming in the kitchen, filling the apartment with ordinary sound. Celine watched her sister go with that familiar expression of fond exasperation, the one that softened her face without weakening it. She will talk about this for years, Celine said quietly. It is a good story, I said. Yes, she replied, as if agreeing to something already decided. The train that evening carried me back through a landscape dissolving into dusk. Dora had fed us again before I left, a smaller meal but more concentrated, as though everything she did followed its own internal logic of intensity. At the door, she had held my hands and looked at me with steady certainty. You are what I thought you would be, she said. Who did you think I would be? I asked. Someone who hears what is underneath what is said, she replied, as if it were a professional classification rather than an observations. Celine walked me to the metro afterward. The city of Lyon carried its evening light with the patience of old stone and long memory, the river nearby adding its quiet weight to everything. She walked close enough that distance was a choice rather than an accident. At the station entrance, she stopped beneath the sharper streetlight and said she did not do anything halfway, that I should understand that before deciding what any of this was. I told her I already knew. I told her I did not either. She looked at me for a long, measured moment, then simply said, good, as though concluding a contract that had already been understood. I stayed until she disappeared into the station. Even after she was gone, I remained in the cold longer than necessary, as though anchoring myself to the moment would prevent it from shifting into memory too quickly. She texted from the train. I answered immediately. The exchange was simple, almost ordinary, but nothing about it felt ordinary anymore. Something had already changed shape. In the days that followed, work continued. Translation pages, linguistic problems, decisions about meaning that could not be fully preserved when carried from one language into another. I thought more often than I expected about what Celine and Dora had called the untranslatable remainder, the part that does not survive conversion, the part that still matters anyway. Celine and I spoke often that week, sometimes by message, sometimes by voice. The first time she called instead of texting, she stayed on the line as I moved through the train station, then through the city, then into my flat. She described her sister's apartment after I had left, the way Dora had simply sat afterward and said, finally, as though something long anticipated had completed itself. Celine said she had spent years believing she knew what she wanted, but without the conditions that would allow it to exist safely in daylight. Not denial, not confusion. Just waiting for the circumstances in which wanting would not feel like risk. Now, she said, she had reached for it. April came with its quieter certainty. She visited twice. Once for work, once without disguise. The second time felt different in ways that did not need explanation. We walked without needing to negotiate silence or speech. She sat beside me while I worked, and I beside her while she read, and neither arrangement felt like effort. When she met the people close to me, there was no performance on either side. Only recognition of something already in motion. On a balcony in the soft edge of evening light, she watched the city below and said she had been thinking about what I had said about being known. Not being read. Not being categorized or understood from a distance, but accompanied. Being known, she said, required participation from both sides, and she had begun to understand that difference only recently. There was a change in her voice when she said it. Not uncertainty, but clarity arriving after long absence. I told her I understood exactly what she meant. And I did. By May. Petra spoke to me directly as she always did, without hesitation or preparation. She made no attempt to disguise what she was thinking. That was her way. She said she had noticed something shifting in her mother since February. A weight she had always assumed was permanent had begun to lift, though she did not yet have language for what replaced it. She did not ask questions she did not need answered. She simply stated what she had observed and accepted it as truth. If you treat her as she deserves, Petra said, I will be on your side. If you do not, I will not be. There was no threat in it, only structure. I told her I had not been uncertain since February. She said she already knew. June arrived with gatherings and gardens and long tables under trees that had seen too many seasons to be impressed by any single one. Dora hosted it the way she hosted everything, formally without announcing formality, turning something social into something inevitable. Celine arrived at the station instead of the apartment, standing near the arrivals board as if she had chosen visibility rather than avoidance. She wore a dark dress I had not seen before, unguarded in a way her usual clothing never was. When she saw me, she said only, "You're here," as if confirming something she had already allowed herself to believe. The gathering unfolded slowly, as such things do when people who understand each other's rhythms are placed in the same space. Dora introduced me with the careful pride of someone presenting not a guest, but a conclusion. This is the man who understands what is beneath what is said. The evening deepened into conversation, wine, and the gradual easing of formality. Celine and I sat apart from the main light later, where the garden softened into shadow and stars began to appear with patient inevitability. She held my hand without looking at it, tracing the inside of my wrist absently, as though learning something without needing language for it. Her silence at that moment was not absence. It was presence without annotation. She spoke eventually about February, about the version of herself that had spoken through a wall, as if solitude were permanent. She did not defend it. She did not disown it either. She simply acknowledged that it had been true for that moment in time, and no longer was. It was not permanent, she said. And I agreed with her. Dora passed through the garden later, paused briefly at the edge of the light, and continued on without comment. That was her version of understanding, brief acknowledgement without interruption. Celine's hand tightened slightly in mine afterward, as though something internal had finally settled into place. The exhale she released was not relief alone. It was arrival. I thought then about everything that had been carried across months and languages and silences, about what had translated and what had not, about what had remained intact even when everything else changed shape. The remainder had not been lost. It had simply been waiting for the right conditions to become speakable. And in that garden, under that sky, with that hand in mine, it finally had.